Marcus Chen saw a faint glow flickering through the trees where no light should exist. Inside the hidden cabin, he discovered a scene that had been perfectly preserved for over 30 years. What he did with that discovery would expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The morning mist clung to the peaks of the Glacier National Forest like ghostly fingers, and the October air carried the sharp bite of early winter that promised snow before nightfall. For Marcus Chen, a seasoned wilderness photographer and former search and rescue specialist, this remote section of the Blackstone Mountain range was as familiar as his own backyard. He had been documenting the changing seasons here for over a decade, creating time-lapse sequences that captured nature's subtle transformations for National Geographic and various conservation organizations. Marcus moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent countless hours in places where a single mistake could cost your life. At 42, his lean frame carried the weathered look of a man who had chosen mountains over meetings, solitude over society. His dark hair was streaked with premature silver from years of exposure to high-altitude sun, and his hands bore the calluses and scars of someone who had pulled dozens of lost hikers from impossible situations. Years earlier, he had walked away from a promising career in emergency medicine in Seattle, trading the chaos of hospital corridors for the ancient silence of old-growth forests. The decision had cost him his marriage and most of his friends, but Marcus had never regretted it. Out here, among trees that had stood for centuries and peaks that had watched the rise and fall of civilizations, he had found something the city could never offer: peace. This particular trail wasn't on any map, not even the detailed topographical surveys used by the Forest Service. It was a path he had discovered himself 5 years ago, threading through a valley that most hikers never saw, where massive Douglas firs towered like cathedral pillars and streams carved their way through granite older than human memory. The trail wound through terrain so difficult that even experienced mountaineers avoided it, requiring technical climbing skills and intimate knowledge of the mountain's moods. Marcus had named it Whispering Valley, though he had never told anyone else about it. Some places were meant to remain secret, pristine refuges from a world that seemed determined to map, measure, and monetize every square inch of wilderness. The hike to Whispering Valley typically took Marcus 6 hours of steady climbing, but today he was taking his time, stopping frequently to capture the autumn light as it filtered through the canopy. His camera equipment, worth more than most people's cars, was distributed across his pack in waterproof cases designed to survive falls, river crossings, and the brutal temperature swings of mountain weather. As he climbed higher into the remote valley, something felt different about the forest. The usual sounds, the rustle of small animals, the calls of distant birds, the whisper of wind through branches, seemed muted, almost reverent. Even the streams seemed to flow more quietly, as if the very landscape was holding its breath. Marcus had developed an almost supernatural sensitivity to the wilderness during his years as a search and rescue specialist. He could read the subtle signs that indicated everything from incoming weather to the presence of dangerous wildlife. Today, those instincts were sending him warning signals he couldn't quite interpret. The forest felt watched. He paused at a familiar granite outcropping that served as his usual lunch spot, pulling out his thermos of coffee and a simple sandwich. From this vantage point, he could see for miles across the valley, and nothing appeared out of place. No smoke from illegal campfires, no glint of metal from abandoned equipment, no signs of human intrusion into this protected wilderness. But the feeling persisted. Marcus finished his meal methodically, his eyes constantly scanning the forest below. 20 years of emergency medicine had taught him to trust his instincts when something felt wrong, and 15 years of wilderness work had only sharpened those instincts further. In the mountains, intuition was often the difference between life and death. He was setting up his camera equipment near a grove of ancient cedars, some over 8 feet in diameter and easily 500 years old, when he first saw it. A faint glow, barely visible through the thick canopy, pulsing with the steady rhythm of artificial light. Marcus lowered his camera, frowning. He knew every cabin, every ranger station, every piece of human infrastructure within 50 miles of this location. There was nothing here. According to every map, survey, and satellite image he had ever seen, this area was completely uninhabited. The light flickered again, unmistakably electric, cutting through the natural twilight of the forest floor like a beacon. Marcus packed his gear carefully, his movements precise despite the growing urgency he felt. His military surplus pack contained emergency supplies for 3 days, climbing equipment, and enough survival gear to handle most mountain emergencies. He had learned long ago that the wilderness punished the unprepared without mercy. As he began moving toward the source of the light, following deer trails and his own hard-won knowledge of the terrain, the glow grew stronger. The forest seemed to close around him, branches catching at his jacket, roots trying to trip him, as if nature itself was trying to keep him from whatever lay ahead. The descent into the hidden pocket of the valley required careful navigation around unstable scree slopes and across fallen logs that bridged rushing streams. Marcus moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who had spent years reading the mountain's language, each footstep placed with deliberate care. Then he saw it, nestled in a clearing that couldn't be seen from any angle except this exact approach, completely hidden from aerial surveillance and invisible to anyone not following this specific route, stood a small log cabin. But this wasn't some abandoned homestead or forgotten hunting lodge that had somehow escaped the attention of the Forest Service for decades. The structure looked like it had been built yesterday, every log perfectly fitted with professional precision, the roof solid and leak-free, windows intact and gleaming as if they had been cleaned that morning. Warm yellow light spilled from those windows, casting rectangles of illumination onto the forest floor, creating an almost fairy tale scene in the gathering dusk. Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he studied the building more carefully. The cabin's architecture was distinctly from another era, 1980s maybe, or early 1990s, but it showed no signs of weather damage, no moss growth, no settling or decay. The logs weren't weathered gray like they should be after decades of mountain winters. The metal roof showed no rust, no accumulated debris from countless storms. It looked as though time had simply stopped the day it was completed. Marcus approached carefully, every instinct from his search and rescue days screaming warnings. Occupied cabins in restricted wilderness areas meant either serious trouble or serious money, often both. He had encountered marijuana grows, meth labs, and survivalist compounds in remote locations before, and they were all dangerous in different ways. He circled the structure once, noting details that made his unease grow with each step. There was no access road, no tire tracks, no sign of how materials could have been brought to this location. The nearest logging road was 20 miles away across terrain that would challenge a pack mule. Yet someone had transported enough materials to build a substantial cabin, along with windows, roofing, and what appeared to be a sophisticated electrical system. The windows were too high to peer through directly from ground level, but he could see the soft glow of what looked like kerosene lamps inside. Old-style hurricane lamps with glass chimneys, burning steady and bright. Who still used kerosene in an age of LED flashlights and solar panels? And more importantly, who was maintaining those lamps in a cabin that should have been abandoned decades ago? At the back of the cabin, Marcus discovered something that made his blood run cold. A small but sophisticated generator, humming quietly in a weatherproof housing, connected to what appeared to be a military-grade ventilation system. The setup was professional, expensive, and designed to run continuously for years without maintenance. Thick power cables ran from the generator into the cabin through specially drilled holes that had been sealed with professional-grade weatherproofing. But operational for what? And who was paying for the fuel that kept it running? Marcus pulled out his phone to check for a signal, thinking he should report this to the Forest Service. The device showed no bars, which wasn't unusual this deep in the wilderness, but the timing felt ominous. He was completely cut off from the outside world, alone with a mystery that was growing more sinister by the minute. He found a gap between logs where the chinking had deteriorated slightly, just enough to give him a narrow view inside. The opening was barely large enough for his eye, but it provided a clear line of sight into the cabin's main room. What he saw through that tiny window would be burned into his memory forever. The cabin's interior was a perfect time capsule from 1987. Everything, furniture, equipment, personal belongings, was arranged exactly as it had been left over 3 decades ago. But it wasn't abandoned or decayed. It was preserved, maintained, kept in pristine condition as if the occupants had just stepped out for a walk and would return at any moment. Tables were set with plates of food that should have rotted decades ago, but looked fresh and edible. A cup of coffee sat steaming on a wooden table next to an open newspaper. Marcus could make out the date, October 15th, 1987. The headline spoke of Cold War tensions, the stock market crash, political scandals that had been forgotten by history. A calendar on the wall showed the same date, with several entries marked in red ink. He could see appointments, meetings, coded notations that meant nothing to him, but had obviously been important to whoever had lived here. But most disturbing of all were the photographs covering one entire wall. Hundreds of surveillance photos of people, buildings, government facilities, and what appeared to be covert operations. Marcus's hands shook as he tried to process what he was seeing. The preservation wasn't natural or accidental. Someone had been maintaining this place for 30 years, keeping it exactly as it was, like a shrine or a monument to whatever had happened here on that October day in 1987. He pulled out his phone and switched to camera mode, taking pictures through the gap, even though he knew the images would be poor quality. He needed evidence of what he was seeing, proof that this impossible place actually existed. That's when he noticed the documents scattered across a desk visible from his vantage point. Official seals, government letterheads, and what appeared to be classified stamps covered pages of text he couldn't quite read from this distance. But he could make out enough to see names, dates, official signatures, and references to something called Operation Timekeeper. The documents appeared to be intelligence reports, surveillance summaries, and what looked like operational orders. Even from his limited perspective, Marcus could see that these weren't routine government paperwork. These were the kinds of documents that carried security classifications, the kinds of materials that people went to prison for possessing. As Marcus adjusted his position to get a better view, being careful not to make any noise that might alert whoever was responsible for maintaining this place, his foot kicked something in the undergrowth. Looking down, he found a weathered plastic bag partially buried under fallen leaves, as if someone had tried to hide it hastily. Inside the bag were more documents, these ones damaged by years of exposure to the elements, but still partially legible. What he could read made his stomach turn and his hands shake with more than just the mountain cold. Asset elimination approved, October 15, 1987. Witnesses neutralized per Protocol 7 Alpha. Site containment protocol initiated. Indefinite duration. Cover story. Hiking accident. Bodies never recovered. The bureaucratic language couldn't hide the chilling reality of what these documents described. People had been murdered here, their deaths covered up with clinical efficiency, their bodies disposed of so thoroughly that they were never found. And someone had been maintaining this cabin as evidence of those crimes for over 30 years. But evidence for whom? Insurance against betrayal? Proof to blackmail those responsible? Or simply a twisted monument to the perfect crime? Marcus photographed every page he could, his mind racing as he tried to understand the implications. This wasn't just an abandoned cabin or even a crime scene. This was proof of a government conspiracy, evidence of murders carried out with official sanction and covered up by people with the power to rewrite history. As he studied the photographs on the wall more carefully through the gap, Marcus began to recognize some of the faces. Politicians who had gone on to hold high office, military officers who had risen to positions of enormous power, businessmen who now controlled vast corporate empires. And they all appeared to be much younger in these surveillance photos, taken around the same time this cabin had been abandoned. The implications hit him like a physical blow. Whatever had happened here in 1987 involved people who were now among the most powerful figures in the country. The victims had discovered something, witnessed something, or threatened something that was worth killing for. And their murderers had spent the next 3 decades in positions where they could ensure the truth never came to light. Marcus was so absorbed in piecing together the evidence, trying to understand the scope of what he had stumbled into, that he almost missed the sound. Almost. But years of wilderness training had sharpened his instincts beyond the ordinary, and the faint crack of a branch breaking under human weight cut through his concentration like a gunshot. He wasn't alone anymore. Marcus froze, pressing himself against the cabin wall, his mind immediately shifting into survival mode. The sound had come from the tree line behind him, too deliberate and heavy to be wildlife. Someone was approaching, moving with the practiced stealth of a professional, trying to remain undetected. But who? And how had they found him? He slipped around the corner of the cabin, using its bulk to shield him from whoever was coming through the forest. His heart hammered as he weighed his options with the analytical precision his medical training had taught him. The nearest marked trail was 3 miles away through dense undergrowth and increasingly treacherous terrain. In this light, with unknown pursuers who obviously knew the area, running would be suicide. But staying meant confronting whoever was responsible for maintaining this monument to murder. Through the trees, Marcus caught a glimpse of movement. 2 figures in dark clothing, moving with military precision, speaking in low voices into radio equipment. These weren't hikers who had stumbled across the same discovery he had made. They weren't Forest Service rangers investigating reports of illegal activity. They were here on purpose, with professional equipment and obvious training. "Perimeter secure," one of them said, his voice carrying clearly in the still mountain air. "No vehicle access detected. Subject likely approached on foot from the Eastern Trail." Subject. They knew he was here. They had been tracking him. Marcus felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had carried him through countless rescue operations in impossible conditions. But this time, he was the one who needed rescuing. He pulled out his phone again, hoping against hope for even a single bar of signal, any connection to the outside world that might bring help. Nothing. The mountains that had always been his refuge had become his prison. The voices were getting closer, and Marcus could make out fragments of their conversation that chilled him more than the mountain air. Words like containment protocol and permanent solution drifted through the forest like death sentences pronounced by faceless judges. As the reality of his situation crystallized with terrifying clarity, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't run. They obviously knew the terrain better than he did and had the equipment to track him. He couldn't call for help. There was no signal. And even if there had been, who could he trust? He couldn't pretend he hadn't seen what was inside that cabin. The evidence was too damning, too important to ignore. But he had something these men didn't expect. The skills of someone who had spent his life navigating impossible situations, pulling people back from the brink of death, and surviving in conditions that would kill most people. He had medical training that taught him to think clearly under pressure, search and rescue experience that had shown him how to find solutions when there seemed to be none, and wilderness expertise that gave him advantages in this terrain. Most importantly, he had moral clarity. Whatever had happened in that cabin in 1987, whoever had been murdered and covered up, they deserved justice. The truth deserved to see daylight, no matter how powerful the people who had buried it. Marcus began to move, not away from the cabin but around it, using every shadow and tree trunk for cover, every technique he had learned from years of moving through dangerous terrain. If these men wanted to silence him the way they had silenced whoever had lived in that cabin 30 years ago, they would have to catch him first. And Marcus Chen had no intention of making that easy. As the 2 men emerged into the clearing, their weapons drawn and their eyes scanning for any sign of their target, they found the cabin exactly as it had been left, perfectly preserved, eternally waiting, its secrets intact. But their quarry had vanished into the forest like smoke, leaving only the faintest trace of footprints in the soft earth. What they didn't know was that Marcus had taken something from the scene, evidence that would expose not just what had happened in 1987, but who had spent 30 years covering it up. The documents in that weathered bag contained names, dates, and operational details that would shatter the carefully constructed lies of some of the most powerful people in America. The hunt was about to begin, and the stakes were higher than either side could imagine. In the preserved cabin, the coffee still steamed, the calendar still showed October 15th, 1987, and the surveillance photographs still watched with silent eyes as new players entered an old game. But this time, someone had seen too much to simply disappear. Marcus moved through the forest like a ghost, using every technique he had learned during 15 years of search and rescue operations. Behind him, the voices of his pursuers grew more urgent as they realized their target had slipped away. He clutched the weathered documents against his chest, the evidence that could expose a 30-year-old conspiracy burning like fire in his hands. The terrain worked in his favor. These mountains had been his sanctuary for over a decade, and he knew every hidden trail, every deer path, every shortcut that didn't appear on any map. His pursuers were professionals, but they were operating in his backyard. As Marcus navigated through a narrow canyon that would slow his pursuers, he risked using his headlamp to examine the documents more carefully. What he read made his blood freeze. The papers detailed Operation Timekeeper, a covert program designed to eliminate witnesses to illegal government activities. The victims in the cabin had been journalists, Sarah Whitmore, David Kellerman, and Patricia Vance, who had uncovered evidence of arms deals with foreign terrorists. They had been lured to the remote location under the pretense of meeting a whistleblower, then murdered by a team led by someone identified only as Agent Phoenix. But the most shocking revelation was in the final document, a list of future targets. Marcus recognized several names as prominent journalists and activists who had died in accidents over the following decades. The cabin wasn't just a crime scene. It was the headquarters of an ongoing assassination program. Marcus realized why the cabin had been preserved so perfectly. According to the documents, it served as a dead man's switch, insurance that if certain people were betrayed or eliminated, the evidence would automatically be released. The generator powered sophisticated recording equipment that had been documenting every conversation, every visitor, every activity for 30 years. Someone had been using the preserved crime scene as leverage against the most powerful people in government. But now that Marcus had discovered it, that delicate balance was about to be shattered. His phone suddenly buzzed with an incoming signal. Somehow, someone was reaching him despite the remote location. The message was chilling. "Mr. Chen, you have something that belongs to us. Return it, or join the journalists in the cabin permanently." Marcus understood the threat, but he also recognized an opportunity. If they could contact him, he could contact the outside world. He quickly uploaded the photos of the documents to a secure cloud server, then sent copies to every major news outlet he could think of. The modern world was different from 1987. Information traveled at the speed of light, and secrets were harder to contain. When the men finally cornered Marcus at the edge of a cliff overlooking the valley, they found him calmly sitting on a boulder, his phone in his hand. "Too late," he said simply. "The world already knows." Agent Phoenix, no longer young but still deadly, emerged from the shadows. "You have no idea what you've unleashed," he snarled. "Those people died to protect national security. They died because they told the truth," Marcus replied. "And now their truth is finally free." The confrontation that followed would determine whether justice was finally served or if the conspiracy would claim another victim. But this time, the evidence was already spreading across the internet like wildfire. The preserved cabin had finally given up its secrets, and 30 years of silence was about to end in an explosion of truth that would shake the foundations of power in America. The standoff ended when Marcus revealed he had live-streamed everything to social media. Within hours, the cabin documents went viral. Agent Phoenix and his team were arrested as international news crews descended on the preserved crime scene. The 3 murdered journalists were finally given proper burials 30 years later. Marcus testified before Congress, exposing Operation Timekeeper and triggering the largest government scandal in decades. 12 high-ranking officials were indicted, including a former CIA director and 2 sitting senators. The cabin was turned into a memorial for Sarah Whitmore, David Kellerman, and Patricia Vance. Truth had finally won, but the cost had been measured in decades of silence and innocent lives lost to protect the powerful.